Welcome to Makers on Screen. I'm your host, Doug Webster, and today's show is Maker Cities, an interview with Peter Hirshberg. In August 2016, the founders of Champlain Maker Faire hosted the Maker Places Conference at the Burlington Hilton. The keynote, Peter Hirshberg, a global expert on improving the vibrancy of cities and towns through the Maker movement, sat down with me after the conference. Peter, can you tell us what a Maker City is?
Sure. This term, a Maker City, really communicates the fact that the Maker movement, which is so much about engagement and creation and possibility, is driving kind of two great trends in our city. One is production's coming back. A Maker City is a place literally where increasingly there's local manufacturing, local production, and the tools of making are becoming democratized, right? So this suddenly means that we're able to manufacture things in smaller batches, in more local arenas. More people can get engaged in that. So it's about production coming back to cities. But more than that, it's really about engagement and people's ability to change and affect the city itself. You know, in the Maker movement, you have the ability to build a solution, go work on a city problem, go make something. So it's also about co-creating the city. We have what we call urban prototyping, people who work on literally parts of town, building public conveyances and fixtures that you might engage with. And they might be park elements, or they might be small library elements, or bike repair shops. So the physical co-creation of something together with production makes up this notion of a more engaged city.
Now, you work a lot with large cities.
Yeah.
San Francisco, New York, others. How does this apply to smaller towns and hamlets and smaller communities?
Well, you know, smaller communities by their nature have always been a bit more self-sufficient and have had a bit more making going on. In a larger city, you could always rely on someone else to do something. So in a way, this is a native thing to smaller towns. And in the current context, in this world of entrepreneurism and creation, I think it's really about a city that has the will to experiment, the will to change, the ability to create space for creative people to work together. You know, today in our conference when we were talking, in a place like Vermont, there's lots of artists who work in studios. There are lots of people in remote areas who create things. The big difference now is people love to be together and in the same space to innovate, to bounce off ideas, to share. We live in a shared network world. So in a rural area, it really is, how can you create space for that? And so much of this is also about training, learning new techniques, right? There's so many new tools that are out there, computer-controlled cutting machines, 3D printers, laser cutters. You kind of want to have a place where you can learn and share. And making is not a lonely thing. It's a little bit different than computer coding. Like, you can sit in front of a laptop and code all day long. But if you're working together and you're building a product, or you're solving a problem, it's a range of skills. So in a way, it's a combination of a community center, and it's also turning to the citizens of a city to go solve problems. So I think this applies, practically anywhere. We called the project Maker Cities because when it started, the White House convened 100 cities, and we got them to make a pledge. About halfway through it, we realized it should probably be called Maker Cities, Towns, and Hamlets.
That you have about questions and discussions that you had with attendees?
One of the things that struck me is how common the problems that are being faced by the smallest cities are with those of the largest cities. This surprised me. So for example, in large places like New York and San Francisco, there's a very rich culture of local production and making, but you need space for this. Space can be expensive. And as cities become more crowded, because people are moving back to cities, where are you going to put local industry? Where are you going to put a maker space? How are you going to afford the rent? It turns out that it's incredibly valuable to have these creative spaces, just as it is if it's valuable to have art spaces. and so cities have to struggle with the rising costs. Well, that's exactly the case in Burlington or even in Manchester, right? So kind of up here, that's a big issue. People are also struggling with how you engage with government and explain what's going on. You know, this is a new movement, right? So when you talk about making, what kind of normally comes to mind is you think of a Maker Faire and you might think of kids who are soldering or using 3D printers, but it's actually continually variable from making to local manufacturing and on up to advanced manufacturing. So this has great import for economic development, but you kind of have to lay that out. And so I think people here were kind of struggling with those same kinds of questions. What kind of curricula should a makerspace have? Who am I training? Am I bringing people in here to go start companies or for artistic purposes or to learn? These questions that we were discussing today, I think, are pretty universal. I mean, the difference is that there's less of a critical mass, so it takes a little bit more to find that, but that was much less of an issue than I expected. Transportation issues are still an issue in a rural area. You know, it's not as easy to get to something like that. There's more commonality than differences.
Okay. Now, the messaging issue, talking to economic development, you know, telling people in the community what making is all about and why it's important for them to support it. It seems like you've got different government institutions or divisions or whatever. Economic development is one, and then we had somebody today that brought up the drug issue. I mean, isn't that another message that we're trying to send and communicate to those people that could potentially support the makerspace? Then it would be economic development. And what would be the differences? And are there other audiences out there that should care about this, and what would be the message?
You know, when we talk about making, it actually codes for a number of things. So first of all, this is about fundamental changes in education. So the way we educate people, you know, the high school system was built for back in the farm, well, started for farm, then it moved on to the industrial era. Today, people have to be educated for constantly changing, always learning new skills, lifelong ability to play with new ideas. So this is fundamental to the world of education because it is about communities, it's informal education, it's portions of schools, so this is a very strong conversation to have kind of in the education sphere. It's also an important part of the civic engagement and civic participation sphere, how to be a citizen. Because if you're engaged with your community, if you're literally using the making skills to go work on a park or go implement sensors in a smart city solution, or you come together in a hackathon and you're trying to find a way to make a part of town safer, all of which is things that people do, you're talking about turning your citizens and your students into a workforce. And think of how civics has been taught, right? We don't even teach it anymore, but it was kind of boring. It's like, here's how a bill moves through Congress, or there are 3 branches of government. If in fact you're given a city problem to solve, like this part of town is not interesting or attractive, or it's not well lit, or it's dangerous, or kind of there's a traffic congestion problem, and how could we use data? If you share these with students and with citizens, you get engagement. So we're talking about education, civic engagement, certainly employment and job creation. And when you bring up the drug problem, you almost have to back up and say, well, why is it people are addicted in the first place? Well, they're either intensely bored, or they're lonely, or they feel hopeless about work. Well, making is an incredibly natural thing. So it turns out if you're making something, you have more pride and you're more interested. You're engaged in solving a problem, and often with people, and these things can lead to skills. So this is another way of saying, here is something that can engage you, excite you, has economic potential, is essentially learning about the future, all sorts of things that kind of cater to what turns us on as people. We happen to call it making, but it's really how you get to participate in the future with meaning. And that is probably a powerful way to take on the unhappiness and the anxiety that leads to addiction.
Correct.
Oh, and here's the other thing. we know it works. There are real cases of, for example, AS220 in Providence is a makerspace where Bert Krenke has brought in kids who were in the legal system or were on drugs. And they basically come in on parole, and they're so excited to be collaborating with other people, making films, building hip hop, working on physical products, that they're just too thrilled and delighted to get in trouble again.
Yes, great. Now, get into education a little bit more in detail. Career and technical education, which you're familiar with. It's been about skill development, and often we hear, well, we need people that can think, process, problem solve, etc. But the structure is set up around skill development, getting your industry certification and so forth. In what ways would making in a career and tech setup help with that other aspect? I mean, some people call it MacGyvers. If you're trying to build MacGyvers, and not just skilled people, but skilled MacGyvers.
Yeah, people talk about, there's kind of like hard skills and soft skills, and so you want to teach people both the technical skills of I'm working with a lathe, or I understand how to use a 3D printer, or I know how to weld, but also problem solving, understanding, and skills. And one of the things that's going on today, I think, is that you get credibility for being able to have multiple skills because there's so many new materials and new techniques, and just kind of natural curiosity. Kids in engineering school today like the idea that they can code and they can work with soft circuits, and they can also kind of work with art. One thing you see going on in the skill world is an unbundling. So if you go into a makerspace, you can learn a particular skill to go solve a particular problem, and there's this notion of badging. You're told, hey, here's a particular thing you've done. Also, increasingly, people are judged on their portfolio as opposed to a credential. So, you make a film, you put it up, you weld, you can show the weld, you created some product from scratch, and so it's kind of like, what have you been able to do? So this is a field that pulls for kind of what are the creative things that I can do and how can I create a portfolio. Making is bringing back apprenticeships, but one problem with traditional apprenticeships is they're often offered by a company and its techniques. So there's a real desire to make something more open and transferable. So there's kind of a renaissance in technical skills now, and I think this is the other thing. We've had it in our society for a while that, there was less interest in manufacturing, and people wanted their kid to go to school and get a BA and be a doctor or a lawyer, or do something that was working with their minds. Well, working with your hands and working with your minds are very commingled now, because you're going to be coding, you're going to be solving a problem, you're going to be building something. So in a way, it's using people better, I think, than before.
Okay, great. Now, in general education, in your K-12 non-career tech, a lot of schools are putting in maker spaces, and oftentimes they end up in the back of the library. Now, part of the reason we changed the name from Maker Spaces Conference to Maker Places Conference was the thinking that it's not a space we're talking about here. It is a place. I don't know if I said that right. Anyway, so your school becomes a maker place versus just having a maker space tucked in the back of the library. What is it? What is your take on that in terms of integrating making within the total curriculum, maybe similar to what High Tech High does, versus having a specific program that only a few students participate?
Making is such a holistic thing. What we're talking about are tools that empower people to express themselves and create. And that is not an atomized little separate thing. That's kind of what life is. Just as computing has kind of seeped into all parts of our lives. 30 years ago there was a computer lab. Well, now the computer lab's in your pocket, and you've got a machine with you all the time. the tools of making allow you, no matter what you're studying, to create something. And you want the idea of education to be a continual exploration of problem solving, the ability to try things. So there indeed may be a place in the building where there's a 3D printer, but it applies to everything. If you look at, Yale University, which is liberal arts college, if there ever was one, has an engineering school, and they put a maker facility in, and they're very thrilled that most of it's being used by undergraduates that aren't studying engineering or particular production, but they have ideas and they want to express themselves. In a way, this is part of literacy in society today to understand and to get closer to these things.
Now, when it comes to making and the economy, on a macro scale, where do you see the maker movement taking our economy over the next 5 years or even 10 years? In terms of job creation, startups, etc. How important is it to our economy?
I think there's significant changes at work in demand and the supply chain, and how much of products have labor content versus kind of software or high value content that has a very big impact here. So the first point to make is I think there's going to be an increasing category of things that are not outsourced to overseas, that are high value, that can be built in smaller batches and more customized, and that will be closer to home. So let's take fashion. 40% of fashion is written down or wasted, or it's the wrong size. If you're able to build something locally, build just what's needed, have more direct sales, if you're using more technology to go build it, you're actually building a use case for stuff being created locally. In electronics, famously, if you're a startup in the wearable or electronic space, you're often told very early on in your funding, go get someone to China, get the expensive injection molds made, and you have to order 50,000 units because that's what China likes. Well, that's an enormous risk, right? If you get the product wrong and you have 50,000, it's out of business. Well, so the idea that stuff can be made locally in smaller batches is going to be, I think, a very important part for the economy. And I think when we say making, I think of it as continuously variable from, okay, one important part of the economy is people are learning a set of these skills. There will also be more locally made and artisanal goods, and that could be food or it could be leather goods, clothing, but then those same skills will be used to make the first 5 or 10,000 of something that eventually may go on to some factory. Also, products, I think, will increasingly become services. They're going to learn, they're going to upgrade, they're going to be continually changing. So the notion that a thing gets built overseas, sits in a boat, comes over here is going to start to change. So it's not going to be the way making looked frozen in time last year at what you saw at the Maker Faire. It's these sets of skills and ideas and literacies, I think, infusing a great deal of the economy. This is a little tough to see early on because our notion of progress is changing. In the 20th century, progress meant bigger. It's like larger plants, more production. It meant ever lower production costs. That meant globalization and outsourcing. That's what progress looked like. And there's a lot of angst in our society because that looks like it leads us out a lot. Probably in the future, progress is going to be more local, more customized, perhaps shorter runs, but for economically good reasons, with richer local roots, but still international trade. City-to-city trade will probably be a very big part of it. So that's going to have a very big impact. It is difficult to kind of measure this stuff today because we're dealing with a phenomenon that's new, and so much of its impact is going to be, I think, in productions and methods that change in the coming years. But I mean, right now there have been some efforts, like Portland literally measured the maker economy, and they know it's kind of about $500 million. New York City has measured kind of what is going on in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is going from 3.5 to 5 million square feet, and they know that by essentially subsidizing production space, there are going to be a whole lot more jobs that get $70,000 a year manufacturing job, as opposed to, say, $35,000 a year in a service job. So that's a pretty big deal. And this is also very important for cities, because literally, you know, a city like Manchester, New Hampshire, can look up at the economy and the creativity of a Burlington, and it has a choice to make. Is it going to attract more of this stuff? You only need a swing of a few hundred jobs and creative people to start changing the tone of a town. So these become critical things for cities, even if at the national level it looks more like noise.
Kind of reminds me of the beer.
The beer, right.
Beer has changed towns around Vermont. Agreed.
Yeah, so one of the things I pointed out today is James Fallows, who's a terrific author at The Atlantic, went on a road trip, an epic road trip of like 50,000 miles with his wife. He went to all sorts of small towns in America, and he saw all sorts of entrepreneurism at work. And he came up with 11 criteria that told you your city is going to do well. And those included things like you had a downtown, you focused on community colleges, you weren't all caught up in national problems, your local leadership was making great progress. And his 11th point is you had a craft beer. Because if you had a craft beer, that meant you had kind of young and enthusiastic people who were kind of artistic and, you know, kind of had some fun and were interested in some set of unique products, and it was a generative thing. And I mentioned that in Vermont, and then I realized that this is the craft beer headquarters of the world. I mean, Vermont is the Napa Valley of beer. So you've proven that point here.
Yes, yeah. And making will follow.
Yeah.
I think. Okay.
Yeah, food, by the way, is these are you know, if you say to someone there's going to be a lot of locally produced goods and they're going to be more artisanal, and will that have an effect on the economy? And it may sound a little bit like woo-woo stuff, but take a look at food, right? There's just been huge interest in more organic and farm to table, and you know, you were telling me the story that McDonald's couldn't succeed here, but the local, you know, much more organic kind of place did, right? Well, this food movement that is just more care and less pre-processed is a very big part of the food economy. And the big food companies are changing. So you can see in the food world that there's this new move afoot. And I don't have to convince you of it, because that's Whole Foods is all about that. Same thing is happening in production. And so you'll start seeing, I think, alternatives to that the big guys like, you know, Walmart and everyone else are going to kind of completely understand, are going to become part of the equation.
Right. So as far as Maker Fairs are concerned, what do you see for new projects in, you know, down the road? What do you see? We're seeing new things every year. I know our Maker Fairs, we're trying to evolve and get new projects in every year. A lot of times you have the same ones, but do you see Maker Fairs changing drastically over the next 5 years?
Well, they're certainly going to reflect kind of new technologies that come out, and they're going to cater to more and more people. I think, you know, one of the interesting things is that so many companies, it's so easy to produce stuff that I notice when I go to a Maker Faire, in a way, I prefer the smaller Maker Fairs, because I can have a better conversation with people who I know are authentic makers. Sometimes in the larger Maker Fairs, anybody that's kind of like building or importing a product might show up. So there's actually something to be said for these things that maintain kind of real individual conversations, and I think that's one of the reasons that I like going to smaller Maker Fairs.
You just watched Peter Hirshberg, a global expert on the vibrancy and economic development in cities and towns through the Maker movement. To see other shows in this series, go to retn.org and enter Makers on Screen. Thank you for watching.